For 300 years, you've been lied to, not by conspiracy, but by consensus. The story you were taught, that history moves forward, that reason liberates, that progress is inevitable. This story is ending, and the bill is coming due. Welcome to the Great Default. Let me take you back to a moment you've never been allowed to see clearly. The 17th century, the Enlightenment. You know the official version. Darkness gave way to light. Superstition surrendered to reason. The human mind, finally unchained from the prison of religion, soared toward truth. But here's what they don't tell you. For every Voltaire who dreamed of a rational paradise, there was a Burke who warned of catastrophe. For every Rousseau who promised liberation through the general will, there was a Maistre who saw the guillotine in those words. For every voice that said yes to the great experiment, there was another that said no, and we erased them. Not with violence, though that came later, but with something far more permanent. Linear history. Linear history is the ultimate weapon of intellectual conquest. It says, those who came before us were primitive. Those who disagreed with us were backwards. And we are the summit of human achievement. It's a beautiful lie, because history doesn't move in a line. It moves in cycles. Civilizations rise, they reach an intellectual peak. They become drunk on their own cleverness. And then they collapse under the weight of contradictions they can no longer ignore. The Enlightenment's great swap was simple. We traded God for science, community for individualism, wisdom for rationalism. And in that trade, we didn't become more free, we became more programmable. Think about it. When humans believed in God, they had a framework that said, there are mysteries beyond your comprehension. There are limits to your knowledge. Humility is a virtue. But reason? Reason had no such restraint. Reason said, everything can be measured, everything can be optimized, everything can be controlled. And so we built a civilization not on wisdom, but on the arrogance of certainty. The conservatives of the 1700s weren't stupid. They understood something we've forgotten, that human beings are not rational calculators. We are creatures of myth, ritual, instinct, and belonging. Strip those away, and you don't get enlightened citizens. You get ghosts wandering through shopping malls. Now let me ask you a question. What's the difference between a medieval peasant saying, Allah knows best, and a modern scientist saying 80% of the universe is dark matter? Both are admissions of ignorance dressed in the language of authority. But only one pretends it's not. Science, real science, empirical science, was supposed to be a method of inquiry, a tool for asking better questions, a way of testing claims against reality. But somewhere along the way, science became the scientific priesthood. And like all priesthoods, it demanded orthodoxy. Consider. You are told that the universe is expanding. You are told that most of your DNA is junk. You are told that consciousness is an emergent property of neurons. You are told that gender is a social construct, or that it's biologically immutable, depending on which scientific priest you ask. And when you question these pronouncements, you are not engaged with, you are excommunicated. Trust the science, they say. But science isn't something you trust. It's something you test. The moment science becomes something you must believe without question, it has ceased to be science. It has become dogma. And here's the cruel irony. The Enlightenment promised to free us from religious dogma, but it simply replaced one form of unquestionable authority with another. The Pope became the peer-reviewed journal. The holy text became the consensus. Heresy became misinformation. Same structure, different vocabulary. We laugh at medieval scholars debating how many angels can dance on the head of a pin, while our own experts debate whether the universe is a hologram, whether we live in a simulation, whether consciousness exists at all. The factory of reality is broken, and the priests are still charging admission. Now we arrive at the heart of the catastrophe. The Enlightenment didn't just change how we think, it changed what we are. For most of human history, the individual was embedded in something larger: family, tribe, community. What Ibn Khaldun called asabiya, the social cohesion that binds people together through shared identity and mutual obligation. You weren't just you were your father's son, your village's defender, your ancestors' continuation. But individualism said, no, you are a sovereign self. You owe nothing to the past. You owe nothing to the future. You are free. And we believed it. So we shattered the family. We atomized the community. We severed the chain that connected generation to generation. And what did we get in return? Freedom? No. We got the modern consumer. The modern slave doesn't wear chains. He wears AirPods. He doesn't live in a hut. He lives in a studio apartment with Scandinavian furniture and motivational posters about authenticity. He doesn't have a master. He has a LinkedIn profile optimized for engagement. He is not oppressed by kings or priests. He is oppressed by his own atomized existence, his own inability to form bonds deeper than a dating app swipe, his own crushing awareness that his life has no transcendent meaning beyond the next dopamine hit. Are you free, or just an optimized data point in a failing market? The Enlightenment promised liberation, but it delivered something far more insidious: the illusion of freedom in a cage you can't even see. Because true freedom isn't the absence of obligations. True freedom is belonging to something worth dying for. And we have nothing left worth dying for. Just things worth buying. On credit. Let's talk about something the experts refuse to name. The West has lost the will to look into the eyes of its own children. Birth rates across Europe, North America, East Asia, collapsing. Not slowly, catastrophically. South Korea, 0.72 children per woman. Italy, 1.24. Japan, 1.26. The United States, 1.62 and falling. These aren't numbers. These are civilizational death sentences. But why? The standard explanations are economic. Housing is expensive. Child care is unaffordable. Student loans are crushing. These are symptoms, not causes. The real cause is spiritual. We have built a civilization based on utilitarian logic. Every decision must be rationally justified. Every action must maximize individual utility. And when you apply that logic to children, the math doesn't work. Children are expensive. They require sacrifice. They limit your freedom. They demand irrational love, the kind of love that doesn't optimize anything, that doesn't produce quarterly returns, that simply is. But we've been trained to think like machines, and machines don't reproduce unless there's an ROI. So we delay, we reconsider. We prioritize careers, experiences, self-actualization, and one day we wake up at 45, successful and sterile, wondering why our life feels like an empty Excel spreadsheet. This is what happens when you replace the soul with the algorithm. The Enlightenment told us to be rational, to question traditions, to reject the oppressive expectations of gender, family, duty, and we did. We questioned motherhood into extinction. We rationalized fatherhood into irrelevance. We optimized ourselves out of existence. Gender, the oldest civilizational technology, the deepest truth written into our biology, became a construct. Not because the science said so, but because the logic of radical individualism demanded it. If everything's a choice, then nothing can be inherent. If nothing is inherent, then nothing is sacred. If nothing is sacred, then nothing must be protected. And so we arrive at the biological suicide. The West isn't being outbred by its enemies. It's choosing extinction over submission to its own nature. Now let's discuss the mechanism by which this madness perpetuates itself. Education. You were told education would set you free. You were told it would teach you to think critically, to question authority, to become an enlightened citizen. But that's not what happened. Mass education didn't create a society of independent thinkers. It created a thought control factory where millions of people learned to repeat the same approved lies with the confidence of expertise. Think about it. In pre-Enlightenment societies, most people couldn't read, but they had oral traditions, apprenticeships, lived wisdom passed from parent to child. Knowledge was local, embodied, tested against reality. Then came universal education, the great democratization of knowledge, except it wasn't knowledge they gave you. It was programming. You spent 12 years, then 16, then 20, in institutions designed not to cultivate your unique genius, but to standardize your thinking. You learned the official history, the approved science, the correct interpretation of literature. You learned to write essays that began with the thesis, supported it with 3 points, and concluded by restating the thesis. You learned to take tests that had one right answer, the answer in the teacher's manual. You learned to compete for grades, for rankings, for admission to the next level of the same system, and at the end, they handed you a diploma and said, "Congratulations, you are educated." But what you really learned was obedience. Obedience to consensus. Obedience to credentialism. Obedience to epistemological hegemony, the idea that truth is whatever the educated elite says it is. The tragedy is this. The smarter you are, the more educated you become, the harder it is to see the bars of your cage, because your entire identity is built on being one of the smart ones, one of the credentialed ones, one of the people who gets it. And to admit the system is broken, that your education was indoctrination, that your expertise is ideology dressed in jargon, would be to admit your entire life is built on sand. So you don't. You defend the consensus, you attack the heretics, you police the boundaries of acceptable thought. Not because you're a bad person, but because you're a product of the system. And the system's first rule is, never question the system. And now we arrive at the endgame. World War III. Not a war that will start tomorrow, but a war that has already begun in slow motion. Economic decoupling, proxy conflicts, militarized rhetoric, alliances hardening, demonization escalating. You feel it, don't you? The tightening, the acceleration. The sense that something massive and terrible is coming. But World War III isn't a random catastrophe. It's the liquidation process of a failed 300-year-old startup called the Enlightenment. Here's what they won't tell you. Civilizations don't collapse because of external enemies. They collapse because they stop being able to reproduce themselves, not just biologically, though that's part of it, but spiritually, intellectually, morally. The West in 2026 is a civilization that no longer believes in itself. It doesn't believe in its past, which it has rewritten as a litany of crimes. It doesn't believe in its present, which it experiences as alienation and meaninglessness. It doesn't believe in its future, which is why it refuses to have children. A civilization that doesn't believe in itself doesn't survive. But it can't simply admit defeat and fade quietly. Because it has built global institutions, economic systems, military alliances, ideological networks that span the planet, and those systems, like a dying star, don't go gently. They explode. World War III isn't about resources or territory or even ideology in the traditional sense. It's about the death throes of a worldview that promised heaven on earth and delivered suburban despair. It's about the collapse of the myth that reason alone can guide civilization. It's about the failure of a grand experiment that tried to build human society on the foundation of individualism, materialism, and the worship of progress. And when that foundation cracks, when the contradictions become unbearable, when the lies can no longer be maintained, when the masses can no longer be pacified with consumption and entertainment, then the system doesn't reform. It detonates. Look around you. Political polarization that makes dialogue impossible. Economic inequality that has recreated feudalism, a media apparatus that doesn't inform but inflames. A generation raised on screens incapable of intimacy, riddled with anxiety and depression. Nations armed to the teeth, ruled by mediocrities, stumbling toward confrontation. This isn't a bug, it's the feature. Democracy, the Enlightenment's great political achievement, was supposed to elevate the wise, but instead it selects for the mediocre. Because in a system where everyone gets a vote, the winner isn't the one with vision. It's the one who panders most effectively to the lowest common denominator. And so we get leaders who are reflections of our own spiritual bankruptcy. Not great men, not statesmen, just managers of decline, reading teleprompters, reciting focus-grouped platitudes while the ship sinks. The Enlightenment promised that reason would replace superstition, that science would replace religion, that democracy would replace tyranny. But reason without wisdom is just calculation. Science without humility is just arrogance. Democracy without virtue is just mob rule. And we are living through the collapse of a civilization that thought it could escape human nature through clever arguments and better institutions. So where does this leave us? Staring into the abyss of a war we can't afford, in a civilization we don't believe in, with a future we refuse to create. The great default isn't coming. It's here. It's in every empty nursery, every medicated mind, every performative argument on social media, every young person who looks at the world and says, "Why would I bring a child into this?" The 300-year experiment is over, not because it was attacked from outside, but because it consumed itself from within. You can't build a civilization on pure reason, because humans aren't reasonable. You can't build a future on individualism, because civilization requires sacrifice for something beyond the self. You can't sustain a society that treats wisdom as superstition, tradition as oppression, and the past as a crime. And you can't avoid the consequences forever. The bill has come due, and the currency is blood.